Across the vast, scorching sands of the Sahara, a dark and painful chapter in history was written. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, a centuries-long exchange that reshaped lives and societies across Africa and beyond. Before we continue, I want to make a quick statement. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade is a very sensitive topic. It negatively affected millions of lives, with lasting trauma that shaped the social, cultural, and economic realities of many African communities. As we discuss this history, please be respectful in the comments and approach this topic with understanding and empathy. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade occurred from the 7th century until the 19th century. It was part of a much larger system of human trafficking, but this trade was unique because it involved transporting enslaved people across the harsh Sahara Desert. It linked sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. While the Atlantic slave trade often gets more attention in history, the Trans-Saharan slave trade was also significant in its scale and impact. Over 10 million people are believed to have been enslaved and forced to cross the desert. These individuals were captured through raids, wars, and by being sold into slavery in local markets. Enslaved people in the Trans-Saharan slave trade were used for a wide range of labor. In North Africa and the Middle East, many were forced into domestic service, served as soldiers, or worked on farms, while others were sold into the growing European slave markets along the Mediterranean. In some cases, enslaved Africans were sent to the Arabian Peninsula, where they worked in households or in various industries. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which was centered around plantation labor, the Trans-Saharan trade saw enslaved individuals spread out over a variety of industries. But the most harrowing part of this trade was the journey itself. The Sahara, with its extreme heat, lack of water, and vast distances, made the passage incredibly dangerous. The journey across the Sahara was not only long but deadly. Enslaved people were often forced to walk across the desert in unbearable heat, and those who couldn't keep up were left behind. The lack of food and water meant that many perished during the journey. It's estimated that for every person who survived, others died from exhaustion, dehydration, or starvation. For those who did make it, life in the slave markets was no better. They were often sold into a lifetime of hard labor, facing abuse and exploitation in far-off lands. Now, let me ask you this: how do you think the Trans-Saharan slave trade differs from the Atlantic slave trade? Was it more widespread, or did it have a different impact on the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Though the Trans-Saharan slave trade eventually waned with the rise of European maritime routes and the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, its legacy was still profound. Millions of African families were torn apart, and entire regions saw their labor forces stripped away. In fact, the loss of so many people from these societies had lasting effects on African economies, cultures, and political systems. The trade created massive wealth for some regions, but it also led to the destabilization of key African kingdoms and empires. Powerful states, like the Mali and Ghana empires, saw their resources drained as many of their people were captured and enslaved. In turn, this caused lasting social and economic disruptions that are still felt today. While this chapter of history is often overshadowed by the larger Atlantic trade, it's essential to understand the human cost of the Trans-Saharan slave trade. The enslaved people who were taken from their homes, the families they left behind, and the generations that were affected have left behind a legacy that we should never forget. To continue exploring African history, be sure to check out the video on the left, where I discuss more African history broken down in the simplest way. If you found value in this video, please consider subscribing to African History Made Easy. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below about other African history topics you'd like to see covered. Your input is important to me, and I'd love to dive deeper into the rich history of Africa with you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.